Good morning, everyone. My name is Raul Fabella. I teach at the School of Economics, which is in neighborhood. Some of my students are here. I was trained as an economist at Yale University, but I consider myself more social scientist than an economist. I don't know if you appreciate the distinction. An economist is one who commits by the neoclassical tradition of maximization and rational choice. I understand most of you who are trained in social sciences. But I also understand that the viewpoint in economics has been, in a sense, slowly invading the other social sciences. That is what I call the neoclassical tradition of rational choice ethic. And today, my talk will be on methodology, or probably the philosophy of science. Which more will be touching on issues that are perhaps important to some, more important to some than for others. Many of you will have accepted the rational choice ethic of economics. It has its own strengths, but it has its own weaknesses as well. And let me tell you from the start, as full information, I am now much less of an economist than a social scientist, which means that I have divorced partly from the rational choice ethic of economics. In other words, I am less committed to the Adam Smith of the Wealth of Nations and more committed to the Adam Smith of the theory of moral sentiment. In a sense, I'm probably closer to you than I used to be. I used to be a neoclassical economist, writing articulations of the neoclassical view of the world. But now I've switched traditions, as it were. And so today, I will talk about my disagreement with the rational choice ethic. Okay. So I actually have an outline, but which was not included. Here it is. This is the outline that I'm going to be presenting through. How do you... So this is the outline that I'm going to be talking through this talk. The first one is first idea that I'll talk about is the free riding problem. The free riding problems are at the heart of all dilemma games in game theory. You probably are aware of game theory, and I don't have to talk too much about it. But I will talk as much as I will need in this talk. So the first one is free riding problem. That's at the heart of all dilemma games. Dilemma games are games that is represented by prisoner's dilemma. In other words, there are the incentives for individuals tend to move away from and tends to move away from the collective good and tends to move towards the individual welfare, but away from the collective good. Now this is interesting because early in the career of game theory, which will be partly a lot of my talk will be, Rappaport and Chama in 1965, so it was early. It was mid-century, mid-last century, have shown that many agents ignore the free riding problem. And so we're going to talk a little about it. The issue involves the decision agent. What is the agent that is concerned in these studies? So what is our better selves? Is our better selves selfish or social? I'll talk a little about Mendel, heredity, and peace story. Remember Gregor Mendel? When I divorced from neoclassical economics, I went closer to biology as a template of social sciences and away from physics as a template. So I'm closer to biology as a template, scientific template for economics. When Gregor Mendel was experimenting with peace, especially with respect to the heredity associated with peace, he came up with the rules. The rules being first generation offspring will not. We only have dominant characteristics. Second generation would have 1/4 recessive characteristics, etc. But when other biologists replicated the experiment, they couldn't get this Mendelian rules to come out. And the reason, and there was a complaint that this guy, Gregor Mendel, must be either he talks too much. His claim was probably wrong. But people do not forget that Gregor Mendel worked on his pea experiment, on the samples, 1 year before he actually ran the experiments. And what he was able to do was he created a different sample, a sample of what he called a pure sample, which is not mixed. So the numbers of the sample that he did experiments on was associated with pure samples. And with pure samples, he was able to get the Mendelian rules or whatever. If you, however, replicated the experiment only on the samples that you pick from the market, you will not be able to get the rules. So here you have a division between the results that you get if you run experiments on samples that are generally just picked up from the market. But if you run experiments on samples that are pure, that have been purified, then you get the experiments on the Mendelian rules. Same thing with rational choice ethic. I consider the rational choice ethic as the view of the economic agent or the human agent as a pure agent. In other words, first of all, the meaning is that the rational choice ethic involves the pursuit of the self, regardless of harm to others. This is, of course, this was the ethic that was embraced by the foundational game theorists, who were mostly mathematicians, Benigno, Mugenstern, and Nash. This was the ethic. This was the agent and trait that they thought was what was proper for human agents at that time. And what developed was that sociality as a trait became completely marginalized in the process. But sociality as a trait never obeyed the preferences of economists and game theorists. Sociality remained in the social sciences, especially led by Herbert Simon, who was an economist who got the Nobel Memorial Prize, as well as eventually by Hamilton University. And of course, the second part of this talk, we will focus on what I call reduced reactive aggression by a Harvard biologist, Richard Brangham. And then I will try to introduce it into the language of game theory. Okay, and finally, of course, I will give the proposition, the final result, where the pursuit of the cooperative nirvana, as it were, is done not through the not because of the retaliative effects of enemies, as it were, but because of the group entanglement associated with greater group commitment among agents. Okay, so perhaps in general, collective action problems, collective action problems are problems that are common to all social sciences, which is why I want to talk about social interactions where the pursuit of the best individual payoffs by players, governed by the rational choice ethic, leads to inferior outcomes. I will give an example of collective action problem. As a way of showing how this rational choice ethic has become important in public discourse. This is a quotation from Margaret Thatcher, time when the ascendancy of the Thatcher Revolution in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the Thatcher Revolution was at the peak, and the ethic that they embraced was essentially the rational choice ethic of game. There are only men and there are only women in society. And of course, there are families. There's no such thing as society as such. Those are just a manner of speaking. So there's just men, and there are women, and there are families. But society really by itself does not exist. Okay. Now, I wanted to give an example. The next one is I give an example of a collective action problem. Collective action problem is generally given as a payoff matrix. It's a matrix. Matrix where the gain of one individual, where the pursuit of individuals of the personal advantage lead to the disadvantage of the group as a whole. In other words, leads to inferior social outcomes. Collective action problems are generally considered to be the reasons why societies are unable to deliver public goods, require public goods from their societies, and generally unable to solve the the corruption associated with public goods provision. So it is very much in keeping with problems of our own society as of today. Two players, A and B. Every player is confronted with strategies. Each player chooses either to cooperate or to defect or not cooperate? Which players face cooperation or defection? If both of them cooperate, they generally will take the cooperative nirvana. Not cooperative nirvana could be the delivery of a dam that was intended for the good of the society. But the problem is the following. If one of the players chooses to be nice, and others chooses the strategy cooperate, the other player could, how do you say that, could free ride on his efforts and not contribute at all. In the process, the non-contributor gets a bonus because he doesn't contribute, but the other guy does. So the other guy, knowing that tendency, would himself try to avoid being a sucker. And he would also, therefore, not choose the strategy cooperate. And therefore, both of them will end up. Okay, so this is an example. If both of them cooperate, both of them, each of them will get 10 units of utility. If both of them defect, if both of them defect, D and D, both of them will get 3 units of utility. This is an inferior state of the world than this, because here everyone gets a higher utility. But if one chooses, or Pedro chooses C, one could choose D, where he gets 15 instead of 10. So it harms Pedro to choose C if the other guy chooses D. And so, in order not to become a sucker, he will also choose D. And all the facts, state of the world, would give them 3 and 3. The dam, or the flood control dam, is not built. It's delivered as a ghost project. So CC is what is required for the dam project to be delivered. That is the Three Gorges Dam in China. 3-3 is when the dam project is not delivered. It's the Eliwat Dam project that has been there in the drawing boards for 20 years and has not been delivered yet. So this is an example of a collective action problem. The best state of the world is being aborted by what is known as the free riding problem. The other guy avoids not to become a sucker, and both of them would therefore choose the social goals. Now let's discuss this a little bit. Early in the career of game theory, Rappaport and Shaman presented results on experiments called prisoner's dilemma games, shown in the board. And what happened is the following. A good number of the subjects, these are normal subjects, like you and me, decided to cooperate, decided to choose strategy C instead of strategy D. This is especially true if the game is iterated and repeated several times. Iteration does not give you C as a solution by itself because of what is known as backward induction hypothesis. It will always give you the result as D and D. So this was so important as a result because Billmore who was one of the gurus of game theory, dedicated a whole chapter in his volume to dispute the result as a fallacy. Hindi daw ito. Then the reason is that it doesn't represent our better selves. Our better selves being selfish. So our better selves would never ignore the free riding problem. But of course, the question is, what is our better self? Is it selfish or social? Is it the slow brain in Kahneman's book called Thinking Fast and Slow? Remember, Kahneman wrote a best-selling book called 2010 called Thinking Fast and Slow. Thinking fast means responding very quickly to situations almost without thinking, but just because of your accumulated wisdom. But thinking slow is deliberate, and really sitting down and thinking about the problem. So thinking fast and slow. And in this book, Kahneman made a distinction between the slow brain and the fast brain. Slow brain is deliberate. The fast brain is quick and quick and dirty. But the quick and dirty thinking in Kahneman involves a lot of our what is known as cognitive biases. Cognitive biases is something that for a long time game theorists did not consider. Cognitive bias is, for example, a framing bias. Framing bias is something like this. If the Kahneman and Tversky go to conference, medical conference, they have questions. The questions are of the following sort. 90% of the time that this particular operation was done in a person, the person dies. That is, he gave that to half of the auditorium. And the other half is 10% of the time that this procedure is given to the patient. The patient is healed. Would you give, the question is the same, would you give or would you administer this procedure to the patient? The persons who got the information 90% of the time the patient died will say no. The other hand, half of the time, half of the auditorium whom the explanation is 10% of the time the person got healed will say yes. So what happens is these are very bright people who are themselves actually administering procedures. They're very bright people, but they have a very different answer to exactly the same information set. 90% of the time the person dies, or 10% of the time the person heals. It's just the framing that's different. So what happens is that then the conclusion is that these doctors are not what is known as the Newman Morgenstern pure thinkers, but they are actually humans who are following or who are affected by cognitive bias. And the cognitive bias here is called framing. You frame the question differently, the answer will be different. So that is a particular example. Okay. Herbert Simon was early voice in the wilderness for sociality in the human agent. In other words, he really believed that the human agent is one that is closer to the cognitive bias thinker of Kahneman and Tversky, and very much further away from the Morgenstern pure thinker. Of course, he was followed after that by Kahneman and Tversky in the 1970s. The difference between Kahneman and Tversky and Herbert Simon was that the Kahneman and Tversky used lab experiments to deliver the message. For example, the framing hypothesis. So the subjects of social science are much more like the piece that you pick up from the market. That's the experiments that the experimenter was using. They're not the piece that were selected and purified by in the process. Of course, Thaler and Sunstein introduced the idea of lunch, which became important in behavioral economics. In the last 20 years, sociality is shown to have very definite footprints in certain genetic loci. In other words, the advance in the sciences have shown that sociality is not just a story, but is actually embedded in the genes of the human agents. Of course, none of these were available at the foundational thinkers, to the foundational thinkers of game theory. Note that the theory of games and economic behavior, which was the basis for game theory, was published in the middle of the Second World War, 1944, where game theory emerged, was intended to understand pure conflict situation. And what was then known as the zero-sum games viewpoint. So what you lose, I gain, what I gain. This is a pure zero-sum game in Morgan's term. The original now let's talk a little about Rana. Rana is a biologist with the Harvard, and he was concerned with how agents, whether they are humans or animals, react to new developments or even strange. In the old biology, the idea of response, reactive response is always fight or flight. One familiar situations. Modern evidence, however, is that the response is spectrum rather than binary. That is known as reduced reactive aggression, which allows agents to pause and assess where in the aggression spectrum is the stranger located. And this has many followers. It is encompassed in another trait which we may call cautious curiosity. Thus, agents run the risk of becoming one set of prey if you hesitate towards a stranger, a new appearance. You can either be eaten, or your prey can escape. And then that's a loss. What? What? A very instances where this offer for alliance is reciprocated. The result is very high productivity. If the stranger is actually a female of the same species, one will actually start a family, a new family, and then a new tribe. So reactive, extractive aggression. This is a risk-taking behavior, and it's part of the spectrum of traits that is accepted. It is now emerging as accepted. Many normal agents in dilemma games pause, signal, and offer a lie just for free running problem. So the question that we asked earlier was, why is it that many agents actually ignore the free riding problem? My answer to that is that they are actually signaling to the other guy of the possibility of alliance. If it is reciprocated positively, the returns are very, very, very high. Now, in a war pact or a lion pride, there is a certain established hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy are the alphas and the betas, and these get the first crack at all bounties, whether the bounties of food or making less food. Prince members are, of course, the last of the tape, and are often the object of very harsh treatment. Of course, they are also sent into exile at sexual maturity to prevent fatal fights over populating females. So if you think about being outside the tribe, being outside uh, and dangers associated with it. The, the question after Robert Gordon and Shaman should have been, why do agents ignore the free riding problem in classic two-person game experiments? And the reason is probably that the, the offer, sorry, the signal for being nice, and therefore being weak and being possibly afraid is being considered by the other persons as a signal, as an offer person, and offer a signal. Of course, remorse, intervention in favor of rational choice is manifestation of better selves. Essentially, that is design sociality hypothesis. So disappeared. And even up to now, the rational choice ethic is still very strong. All the social sciences, including economics, this I refer to the golden school of and the viewpoint that based on modern evidence, in reasoning and like should now be included among the phenotypes supported by survival-seeking genome of economic agents. I call this group entanglement. Perhaps one reason why rational choice persisted so long is that it is not flatly wrong. In other words, there are aspects of reality that it covers. But reality is represented, but the reality that it represented was largely incomplete. I refer to Newtonian mechanics in physics. It started to wane only after it was shown to be incomplete. That is, it was not able to explain the bending of light near large bodies or large masses, which was a 2019 experimental result. Reciprocity is now, of course, a very important canonical idea in biology. Conditional cooperation is a universal norm and may thus be genetic, and may thus be a genetic predisposition by Gardner in 1960s. Trivers, 1971, introduced reciprocal altruism, which was first regarded with suspicion, but has become also widespread in biology now. Reciprocal rationality combines the behavioral traits. On one hand is reduced reactive aggression. That means you pause. You see where in the aggression spectrum the stranger is located. And then the other is vindictiveness, when the agent responds with an eye for an eye. Thus, the agent in employing trigger strategies that is common in game theory. In fact, most of game theories are trigger strategies. Already exhibits a rather higher level of rationality, incorporating the Axelrod triangle. Axelrod carried an experiment where he invited all game theorists to submit their solutions to a iterated game problem. In other words, games that are repeated. And you could submit anything at all as a strategy for solving this problem. And the strategy that won the experiment of Axelrod is known as tit for tat. Tit for tat means you start off being friendly. In other words, if there's a stranger, you first show an aptitude or a tendency to cooperate. And you continue cooperating until the other guy decides to defect. And then you defect as well. And then you also, if he stops defecting, then you cooperate again. That's what is known as the Axelrod triangle. Be friendly, be ready to retaliate, and be forgiving. This strategy for iterated games. The idea is to get the best out of the best results out of iterated games. Did not win all the games, but like the French the French bicycle race, you can win without getting a first in any of the sections. If you get a second in every section, you can win the whole thing. And tit for tat was like that. It didn't win in any of the sections, but it was always close to winning. And because of that, it was declared as the overall win. So now I will try to connect this with the game code or CAP. So I consider the what is known as stage in the interaction. Okay? We consider that the agent's imputation. We consider that agents are all game imputes to the other party a particular trait, which is their friend or a friend. So every party in the CAP imputes a probability G, little g, that that the other party is friendly, and 1 minus g that the other party is unfriendly. And the counterparty does the same. So g prime and 1 minus g prime. So that's what you call an offer to become entangled. When there's that pause. If we have applied the imputation of process, Pedro's expected payoff with strategy C is ng plus 2 times 1 minus g. That is, if 1 is deemed an R1 with probability G. Okay. 1 would choose C in response to C, and Pedro gets 10. If Pedro deems 1 as IR, 1 will choose D in reply to C of Pedro, and Pedro gets 2. Since Pedro's imputation is G, that 1 is RR and 1 is G as IR, Pedro's expected payoff with the choice of D is the following. And now I choose a G where this choosing a C or a D gives you the same payoff. And it comes down to this. Note that A is indifferent between C and D if this is correct. The equalizing G equals G star is that G star is equal to 1. What it says is if Pedro thinks that 1 is friendly by greater than 1/9 of the likelihood, then Pedro will make C the dominant strategy for Pedro. When the symmetry of the game, the probability for 1 is G star also equal to 1/9. And so any imputed G prime greater than 1/9 will make one choose C. That's dominant strategy. Therefore, any imputation pair G prime greater than 1/9, greater than or equal to 1/9, will make both players choose C in the CAP game. So the numbers would change as the payoffs. are different. The numbers will change. But there's one thing that you can say in general, that is that if the imputation is high enough, then all cap games will result in the cooperative impact. And the dam will be built, like the three just. Of course, you can do that in general. You can do these algebra. The proposition simply says, suppose players A and B, they have a matrix captain, and each has two possible behavioral types, reciprocally rational or individually rational. Reciprocally rational is really friendly. Individually rational is really anti. Behavioral type of one party is known to the other only up to a probability distribution. And players A or B imputes probability G, G prime that the others are and one minus G prime that the other is I. Then for every matrix coupling, there always exists a high enough imputation, probability imputation pair, G prime, such that CC is expected dominant strategy. So that is the general proposition that I offer as an alternative to the Nash solution. The Nash solution is player stops, but nobody can do any better for himself. Here, the player stops, but everyone's friendly to each other. Has proven, or has shown himself friendly. What he asked the judge, because of the what he said, judge, any taxpayer will deliver public goods we have funded public goods. What is the difference between where we could address production with those public goods? We suggest that as a society, we must mind elder or mind meld is a term used for 1911 is a national researcher of seniors. And his view of cancer is very interesting. Cancer is a group of cells that have divorced themselves from the original for example, group of cells that are part of the liver that have divorced themselves from being part of the liver by pursuing their own their own welfare as a little group, and away from the welfare of the liver as a whole. And there are many reasons for that case. Make sure the poisoning that cancer cells become cancers. But the therapeutic approach of David Levin is different. His therapeutic approach is to bombard the cells with different bioelectricity voltages, so that at some point they're not getting the wrong information. At some point, if they get the right information, they will return to the liver as part of the liver, the original idea. This has been proven already correct, but at the moment, not in terms of human cells, but in terms of single cells, which they injected with oncogenes, and then they allow the cancer to develop, and then they bombarded the single cell with different informational bioelectric information, and the cancer disappeared. So it's interesting. The experiment with larger cells or larger agents is not being done. But hopefully, this approach would also become important. You know, what does this do? What this does is, if you are in an inferior social situation state, you can bombard the cells with the right information, and if you are lucky, they can absorb this right information, and then they could revert to their proper role as part of the liver cells. That is the future of this therapeutic approach. So in this case, the cells in the liver, they are mind-melded to deliver what the liver is originally conceived to perform, and that is the cleansing of blood. So are we, as a nation, mind-melded enough? Apparently. A part of us have a tendency to form their own subgroups and make themselves rich with the form of the other groups. These are, of course, what is known as the corrupt syndicates in Congress as well as in the Department of other departments. So our invitation of fidelity to our national brethren seems to show of the nation as a whole. We impute fidelity to all brothers, the family of families, but will not impute the same. Very strong. We need to employ, greater socialization programs, or spirit for programs, to raise our reputation to the nation. Otherwise, we can resort to statutory pathway explainable. Statutory pathways is make people behave by statutes, by laws. The problem with statutory pathways, by the way, I have a talk at the Convergence and the Rules conference for Fidelity on Monday, and I will talk about the pathways, the different pathways. The statutory pathways to cooperative nirvana requires an upright third party. Upright third party, upright congressman, upright, etc. Otherwise, you get an orgy of corruption. This means that it's the pathway to confront the age-old problem of who judges the judges, who referees the referees. Say the Chinese imperial household, etc. Employed eunuchs. Eunuchs are castrated judges, are castrated individuals. Because they're castrated, they cannot form families. And because they cannot form families, you reduce the conflict of interest between family and nation. The idea is eunuchs will be better public servants because their fidelity will be less to their families and therefore more to the nation. With greater regard for the community. In the language of the neuroscience at the moment, eunuchs are closer to the prefrontal cortex. That's their amygdala is the center of fear and emotion. Prefrontal cortex is the executive center. Therefore, the center of what you should be doing. What you should be doing. And that is why in ages of old, the eunuchs were considered to be possibly better public servants. Incidentally, the eunuchracy lasted for a long time, which means that they were actually good for their policies. Now I will return to Adam Smith. Adam Smith's attempted um, resolution to the problem of referees in the world of nation. He advocated what is known as the unbiased spectator. Unbiased spectator is approximated by stoic moral education to train future public servants to resist being corrupted by power. His, his solution to this age-old problem of who referees the referees is the unbiased spectator, which in history have been also approximated partly by bureaucracy, the use of euros, and in the church, the use of celibacy. In fact, in Greek political tradition, it is approximated by what is known as sortition. Sortition is election of leaders by lottery. So every citizen, qualified citizen, is a possible leader. And your name can come out by sortition. Sortition is a way of separating aristocracy from leadership, or wealth from leadership. If your leaders are chosen by sortition, then it's possible that your leaders would be the lowest income group in society. So it's a way of divorcing the aristocracy or the money class from the leading, from the decision-making class. That is sortition. And that is partly the suggestion by Adam Smith of unbiased spectator. But what is the most interesting shortcut to the unbiased spectator? The most interesting shortcut to the unbiased spectator are called humanoid robots. These are AI humanoids, trained in the best tradition of law enforcement. On the best tradition of law enforcement. We cannot have a judge trained in the tradition of Davos, legal tradition of Davos. It has to be global, the best global tradition. And these are called humanoid. My suggestion, of course, is my suggestions to replace judges with aliens. In other words, castration, technical castration of our legal system. I don't think you will accept judges that are castrated physically. I think you will accept judges that are castrated technically, which is human. And I will end my talk there.